The night was pitch black, the kind of darkness that swallows even the sea itself. It was November 8th, 1943, somewhere in the Philippine Sea. 14 Japanese cargo ships moved in neat formation, flanked by 4 destroyers cutting silently through the waves. No lights. No radios, no moon, only rain and wind. To their commander, the convoy was safe. After all, submarines were blind at night, weren't they? But 20 miles away, in that same darkness, another vessel watched them with unblinking eyes. A U.S. submarine, the USS Pargo, was gliding just below the surface. Its periscope was down. Its crew couldn't see a thing. Yet in the conning tower, a young radar operator stared at a glowing circular screen. Small, bright dots pulsed across it, each one a Japanese ship. To him, the convoy was as clear as day. What the Japanese didn't know was that American submarines had changed. Mounted on their bridges was something entirely new, a small rotating antenna that sent invisible pulses of energy into the night and listened for the echoes that came back. Radar. The same miracle that warned of bombers over London and guided Allied ships through fog had now been made small enough to fit aboard submarines. It was called SJ radar, and it would rewrite the rules of naval warfare. In a single moment, the balance of the Pacific tilted. Until that night, submarine warfare had been a game of chance, long hours of waiting, endless days of searching, and attacks that relied on luck and guesswork. But with radar, the hunter no longer depended on daylight or periscope sightings. For the first time, a submarine could see in total darkness. While the Japanese relied on human eyes, the Americans relied on science, and that difference would sink an empire. At midnight, torpedoes tore through the black water. Explosions ripped across the convoy. By dawn, 6 ships were gone. The surviving Japanese commander wrote in disbelief that such an attack was impossible. He was right by the rules he knew. But war had changed, and he didn't yet understand how. For the next 3 years, American submarines would use this invisible weapon to hunt relentlessly through the Pacific. They would sink over 1,200 ships, starving Japan of oil, food, and steel. And through it all, the Japanese Navy would never discover the truth, never realize that the enemy could see them while remaining unseen. Radar didn't just illuminate the ocean. It illuminated the future, a future where information, not numbers, would decide wars. And beneath that dark Pacific sky, inside a cramped steel tube filled with sweat and fear, a handful of American sailors had just changed the course of history without the enemy even knowing it. In 1941, the U.S. Navy faced a haunting truth: its submarines were invisible, but also blind. Beneath the waves, a commander could hide from the enemy, but he could not find him. The periscope was their only eye, and in darkness or bad weather, even that eye was useless. The ocean was vast, and convoys could vanish into it like ghosts. That began to change when a handful of scientists in the Naval Research Laboratory and at MIT's Radiation Lab took on an impossible challenge: to give the submarine sight. What they built was small, fragile, and revolutionary, a device that used radio waves to detect ships beyond the horizon. They called it the SJ radar. It worked on a wavelength of 10 centimeters, what engineers called S-band. That short wavelength meant sharper precision, smaller antennas, and the ability to fit the system into the cramped steel confines of a submarine. The heart of the system was the PPI scope, a round, glass display that glowed green in the dark. The operator sat in front of it, eyes fixed, hands steady, watching the ocean not as waves and darkness, but as points of light. A bright dot meant a ship. A moving dot meant a target. For the first time in history, a submarine could see a convoy 15, even 20 miles away at night, in fog, in storm. It was a miracle of science born from desperation. At first, few believed it would work. Radar was big, power-hungry, and fragile. Submarines were small, loud, and already crammed with machinery. Installing the first sets required removing bunks, rewiring systems, and training sailors to operate technology most had never heard of. Yet the need was urgent. American submarines were struggling, and Japan's empire was expanding unchecked across the Pacific. When the first few SJ sets were tested at sea in mid-1942, the results stunned everyone. Submarines could track ships beyond visual range, approach from the perfect angle, and strike unseen. Suddenly, the hunter no longer hunted by guesswork. Every attack became a calculation distance, bearing, speed, course all plotted with the cold precision of radar beams cutting through the night. By 1943, almost every fleet submarine in the Pacific carried the SJ radar. But this was no ordinary piece of equipment. It was top secret, guarded more closely than torpedo designs or codebooks. Crews were forbidden to mention it in radio messages. If a submarine was in danger of capture, they were ordered to destroy the radar immediately. No trace of it could ever fall into Japanese hands. The secret held. For nearly 2 years, Japan fought a phantom enemy it could neither see nor understand. Convoys disappeared under cover of darkness. Ships exploded in moonless seas. Commanders reported attacks that defied every rule of submarine warfare they'd been taught. How, they asked, could submarines find them without light? How could they aim so precisely when no periscopes were raised? The truth that those submarines carried the eyes of science never crossed their minds. The Japanese Navy had radar of its own, but it was primitive, fragmented by inter-service rivalry, and plagued by distrust of new ideas. Their destroyers rarely carried search radar. Their merchant ships almost never did. Their submarines had none at all. The Imperial Navy still trusted the human eye-trained lookouts with exceptional night vision and binoculars crafted to perfection. But even the sharpest human eyes could not pierce 20 miles of rain and black water. So the Americans hunted in the dark, unseen, unheard, unstoppable. A commander would raise the radar mast, its antenna rotating slowly, scanning the horizon. The operator called out bearings in a calm voice. Contact bearing 015, range 18,000 yards, multiple echoes. The plotting officer traced dots on the chart, connecting the moving positions of each contact. Within minutes, the captain knew everything. How many ships there were, how fast they were moving, what course they followed. Then he would smile, a quiet, grim smile, and whisper, "Set intercept." The submarine turned into the convoy's path, slipping through the Black Sea. Diesel engines rumbled softly. The crew spoke in whispers. In the radar room, the screen pulsed rhythmically like a heartbeat. The captain waited until the range closed to a few thousand yards. Then he gave the order, "Fire 1, fire 2." Moments later, thunder erupted across the ocean. Torpedoes slammed into steel hulls. Explosions echoed across the night. Japanese sailors screamed into the darkness, not knowing where death had come from. By the time the destroyer escorts began dropping depth charges, the submarine was gone, radar mast retracted, running silent beneath the waves, tracking its next prey. Radar had turned the ocean into a chessboard. The Americans could move their pieces with certainty. The Japanese played blindfolded. It was more than a weapon, it was a new way of thinking. It made submarine warfare not a game of chance, but a science of precision. From 1943 onward, young American skippers learned to trust the green glow of the radar more than their own eyes. They knew that in darkness lay safety for them, and death for the enemy. Convoys that once believed night protected them now faced their doom after sunset. The sea, once Japan's shield, became its graveyard. The SJ radar was the unseen edge of American victory. It never fired a torpedo, never sank a ship by itself, yet it guided every deadly strike. It gave commanders the power to see beyond human limits, to find, to aim, to survive. And because the Japanese never learned of its existence, the advantage endured, unchallenged, until the war's very end. It's said that in war, knowledge is the ultimate weapon. In the dark Pacific nights of 1943, that weapon pulsed in waves of invisible energy circling through the rain, bouncing off steel hulls, whispering back to American submarines, "They're out there. You are not blind anymore." And from that moment on, the hunters of the deep could see. By 1943, the Pacific Ocean had become a mystery Japan could no longer solve. Convoys were vanishing in the dark, entire fleets of merchant ships, slipping beneath the waves without warning, without survivors, without explanation. Reports came in from every corner of the empire. Tankers lost near Formosa, transports missing between the Philippines and Palau, freighters sunk within sight of home waters. At first, Japanese commanders blamed bad luck. Then, they blamed American codebreakers. Finally, they turned to superstition, the belief that perhaps fate itself had turned against them. But what they could not imagine, what no one in the Imperial Navy dared to believe, was that the enemy could see them when they could not see back. To the men who had ruled the Pacific in 1941 and 1942, the idea was absurd. The Japanese Navy prided itself on discipline, training, and eyesight so keen it bordered on the legendary. Their lookouts were trained to spot ships at 20 miles, to see silhouettes against moonlight, to read the sea like a book. They trusted their eyes, they trusted their instincts, and they trusted the doctrine that had made them victorious. That doctrine was built on a simple belief that the night belonged to Japan. In the early years of the war, Japanese sailors had dominated night battles. Their optics were superior, their torpedoes faster, their coordination flawless. But by 1943, the ocean itself had turned against them. They were sailing into ambushes they could neither predict nor understand. Every measure of caution failed. Convoys zigzagged their routes. They changed courses every 20 minutes. They ran in silence. No radios, no lights, no signals. Destroyers guarded their flanks, dropping random depth charges into empty water just to make their presence known. And still the attacks came. One after another, Japanese captains wrote the same words in their final logs. Enemy unseen. Torpedoes struck without warning. No periscope sighted. To them, it was as if the Americans had become ghosts. The truth, of course, was far more terrifying than ghosts. It was radar. Invisible waves sweeping through the darkness, bouncing off steel hulls, whispering their secrets back to the submarine that waited patiently just over the horizon. But the Japanese Navy never discovered it. Their own radar program, though begun as early as 1936, was fractured by bureaucracy and rivalry. The Imperial Army and Navy refused to cooperate, each hoarding discoveries as private property. When Japan finally installed radar on its ships, it was crude, short-ranged, unreliable, and rarely used. Crews distrusted the technology, preferring their eyes. Commanders often ordered radar sets turned off, fearing they would emit signals that American aircraft could detect. The result was catastrophic blindness. By mid-1943, Japan's merchant fleet was already under siege, but that year, the losses exploded. Over 1.8 million tons of shipping were sent to the bottom 3 times more than the year before. The survivors tried to explain the impossible. Some claimed American submarines had found a way to hear ships from miles away. Others swore the Americans had trained sea creatures to attack. One captain, desperate and half-mad after his ship was sunk, insisted that the enemy had eyes of the gods. He wasn't far from the truth. The Americans had mechanical eyes, cold, unblinking, and tireless, and they used them without mercy. Every time a Japanese convoy left port, somewhere beneath the waves, a submarine's radar swept the sea, waiting for the echoes that would seal their fate. And the losses kept coming. Oil tankers carrying precious fuel from the Dutch East Indies, freighters loaded with iron ore, rubber, rice, transport ships carrying thousands of soldiers to distant garrisons, all gone erased from the sea in the silent hours of night. By late 1944, Japan's shipping network was collapsing. Factories stood idle for lack of materials. Airfields ran out of aviation fuel. Armies on island garrisons were stranded, starving, forgotten. The great empire that had conquered half of Asia was now trapped within its own walls, surrounded not by fleets or aircraft, but by an invisible cordon of submarines guided by radar. And yet Japan still didn't know. Captured American sailors revealed nothing. The few submarines Japan managed to destroy sank with their secrets intact. Even as late as 1945, Japanese intelligence reports speculated that the Americans might be using magnetic detection or some form of advanced listening device. Radar on submarines? Impossible, they said. The technology was too large, too fragile, too power-hungry. Their disbelief became their downfall. It's one thing to fight an enemy who is stronger than you. It's another to fight one you don't understand. Imagine being a Japanese destroyer captain, sailing through black waters, knowing that somewhere out there, perhaps right beside you, lurks an unseen enemy. Your lookouts scan the horizon until their eyes burn. The radar set on your bridge hums faintly, showing nothing. You tell yourself you're safe, but then the torpedoes come. 1, 2, 3. In seconds, your convoy erupts in fire. The sea burns, men scream, and you never even saw it coming. That was the nightmare of the Pacific. And it repeated itself, night after night, for 3 relentless years. Japan's naval officers called it un-May fate. But it wasn't fate, it was physics. Invisible waves, 10 centimeters long, pulsing out from a steel hull in the dark. Radar had turned the laws of war upside down. The hunters had become the hunted. The masters of night had become blind men walking into their own graves. By the time the war ended, the Japanese still didn't know the full truth. They surrendered believing that American submarines had simply been more aggressive or more skilled. Only years later would historians uncover the real reason their ships vanished in the dark. It wasn't luck, it wasn't fate. It was technology and the courage of those who dared to use it. By early 1944, the Pacific had changed. What had once been Japan's empire of islands and trade routes, a web of ships connecting the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, China, and the home islands, was now a graveyard of twisted steel and oil-slicked waves. The arteries that fed Japan's war machine had been cut, one, by submarines that the Japanese could neither find nor understand. Every ship that left port did so under a shadow. From Pearl Harbor and Fremantle, from Brisbane and Midway, American submarines slipped silently into the Pacific, guided by the green glow of radar screens. They were no longer just hunters, they were executioners in a silent economic war, and their targets were not battleships or carriers, but the lifeblood of Japan itself, merchant ships, tankers, transports, and freighters. Japan's entire strategy depended on the sea. Its factories had no oil of their own, no iron, no bauxite, no rubber. Every bullet, every airplane, every warship depended on the endless flow of cargo ships bringing resources from conquered lands back to the home islands. Without them, the Japanese empire would starve not metaphorically, but literally. By mid-1943, the American submarine force had learned how to strike with precision. Radar gave them eyes, code-breaking gave them direction, experience gave them confidence. Now, every patrol was a mission of strangulation. A submarine would leave base, dive beneath the surface of an enemy trade route, and wait. Radar allowed it to detect convoys before the enemy ever knew it was there. The captain would plot the convoy's course, race ahead on the surface, and set an ambush under cover of night. When the radar showed the ships within 10,000 yards, the order came quietly: stand by torpedo tubes 1 through 6. Moments later, the sea exploded. Torpedoes ripped through the dark, slamming into ships heavy with coal, fuel, or food. Fire rolled across the water, lighting the clouds in orange and red. And by the time the escorts reacted, by the time the first depth charge fell, the submarine was gone, slipping beneath the surface, radar mast retracted, tracking its next target. This was not random destruction. It was deliberate, systematic, and devastating. In 1942, before radar, American submarines had sunk around 500,000 tons of shipping. In 1943, with working torpedoes and SJ radar, that number jumped to nearly 1.9 million tons, but 1,944 was the breaking point. In that single year, U.S. submarines sank more than 600 ships, totaling 2.7 million tons more than in the first 2 years of war combined. Every loss was a wound Japan could not heal. Factories shut down for lack of fuel. Airfields ran out of gasoline. Trains stopped running. Food shipments from Southeast Asia dwindled until Japanese cities faced starvation. The once mighty Imperial Navy began rationing its own oil, keeping warships tied to the pier for lack of fuel to train or fight. By 1945, Japan's industrial output had fallen to a fraction of pre-war levels. Not because Allied bombers had destroyed every factory, many were still standing, but because the materials simply stopped coming. The submarines had won not just at sea, but in the factories, in the kitchens, and on the streets of Tokyo itself. And the most tragic part? Japan never knew why. Had they realized that radar was guiding the submarines, they might have built detectors to warn of radar emissions. They might have equipped escorts with better radar of their own, or changed their routes to avoid radar's line of sight. But ignorance is the deadliest weakness in war. The Japanese kept sailing the same convoys, using the same tactics, convinced that their enemy was lucky when in truth, luck had nothing to do with it. To the men aboard those doomed ships, the war turned into a nightmare of waiting. They would steam into the night, the engines thudding below deck, the air thick with fear. Every splash, every sound in the dark felt like a torpedo coming. When the attack finally came, it happened without warning. A flash, a roar, and then silence. Survivors clung to wreckage as burning oil spread across the sea, watching their ships slip beneath the waves. The ocean, once Japan's pride, had become its executioner. For American submariners, each patrol meant another set of names erased from the map, another convoy gone, another artery of the empire severed. They called it the silent service, but their work spoke louder than any victory parade. In the words of one submarine commander, "We didn't just sink ships, we sank an economy." By the spring of 1945, Japan's merchant fleet was almost gone. Of the 6 million tons of shipping it had at the start of the war, barely 1 million remained. The rest lay on the ocean floor. Troops stranded in China and the Pacific Islands couldn't be resupplied. Civilians at home faced starvation. Even the Japanese Navy couldn't move its own fuel. The empire that had begun the war with dreams of conquest was now suffocating in isolation, and through it all, the Japanese never learned the truth. Not until after the surrender would they discover that their enemy's greatest weapon wasn't a bomb or a battleship or a new torpedo, it was a rotating antenna mounted on the bridge of a submarine, quietly scanning the horizon, unseen in the dark. It said that the most dangerous enemy is the one you never see. For Japan, radar made that proverb reality. It turned night into a weapon, silence into strategy, and technology into triumph. The Pacific War would end with mushroom clouds, but its fate was sealed long before in the green glow of radar screens deep beneath the waves. They called it the Silent Service, a name that sounded noble, maybe even peaceful, but there was nothing peaceful about life inside a US submarine during World War II. Imagine 80 men sealed inside a steel tube, 300 feet long and barely wide enough to stretch your arms. The air grows hotter and thicker every day. Diesel fumes hang heavy. Salt sweat mixes with the smell of oil, battery acid, and fear. Privacy doesn't exist. A single mistake could mean death. And yet, these men volunteered. They knew the odds. 1 in 5 submariners would never come home. 52 submarines, 52 crews vanished during the war, some without a trace. That was a casualty rate higher than any other branch of the American military. But still, men lined up to serve beneath the waves. Why? Because they knew that what they were doing mattered more than anything else. Each patrol wasn't just a mission, it was a strike at the heart of Japan's empire. Every ship they sank meant fewer planes, fewer tanks, fewer bullets aimed at Marines on Pacific beaches. Each torpedo launched in the dark helped shorten the war. They didn't fight for glory, they fought for results. A submarine on patrol was a world apart, a cramped, mechanical hell where time lost all meaning. Day and night blurred together. The crew worked in shifts, sleeping in narrow bunks stacked 3 high, sometimes above live torpedoes. Every inch of space was used. Some men slept beside spare parts or machine tools. The heat could reach over 100 degrees. Fresh food spoiled within a week. Showers were limited to seconds, sometimes forbidden altogether. When submerged, the air filled with carbon dioxide until men's heads throbbed and their lungs ached. And when the alarm sounded, "Dive, dive, dive," every man moved with precision drilled into muscle memory. Hatches slammed shut. Lights dimmed. The submarine tilted downward. Seconds later, the world turned into darkness and pressure. They listened. Always listened. Above them, Japanese destroyers searched the waves. The sound of enemy propellers echoed through the hull. Then came the depth charges, distant thuds that grew into thunder. The explosions rocked the submarine like a toy. Lights shattered, instruments cracked, water sprayed from valves. Every man froze, knowing that the next blast could rip the hull open like paper. For hours, sometimes days, they endured. Silent, motionless, breathing poison air, praying. When it was over, they surfaced, repaired what they could, and went back to work. Because the job wasn't done. Among these men were legends, commanders whose names became whispered symbols of courage. There was Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton, captain of the USS Wahoo. He revolutionized submarine tactics, attacking on the surface at night and proving that radar could turn darkness into an advantage. Morton sank over 20 ships before the Wahoo was lost in 1943, destroyed in a final, defiant battle that sent him and his 80 men to the bottom of the La Perouse Strait. Then came Commander Richard O'Kane, Morton's former executive officer and captain of the USS Tang. O'Kane pushed the limits of aggression, sinking 13 ships on his 5th patrol, a record unmatched in submarine history. But fate turned cruel. His final torpedo malfunctioned, circled back, and struck his own ship. Tang sank in seconds. O'Kane and 8 others survived. The rest went down with their boat. Each submarine lost carried a story like that: bravery, sacrifice, and silence. Some simply disappeared. No distress call, no wreckage, no answers. Wives and families received telegrams with only a few words: missing in action, presumed lost. For those who survived, the end of the war brought relief and guilt. They returned to a world that could never truly understand what they had endured. They carried memories of depth charges, of the smell of burning ships, of the faces of crewmates who never surfaced again. They had done their duty, but at a cost only they could measure. Many kept their silence for decades. Their missions were classified, their victories secret. When they did speak, their words were quiet, understated. They didn't see themselves as heroes. They were professionals, engineers, sailors, soldiers who had done a terrible job because it needed to be done. But history remembers. These men, fewer than 2% of the US. Navy were responsible for over half of Japan's shipping losses. They sank 1,200 merchant ships and 200 warships, more destruction than any other single force in the Pacific. Their courage crippled Japan's industry, starved its armies, and hastened its defeat. They didn't win parades. They didn't make headlines. But they changed the course of the war. The technology they carried, the SJ radar, became the ancestor of every modern sensor system used today. From sonar and stealth detection to electronic warfare, its legacy lives on in every submarine that prowls the oceans of the 21st century. But beyond the machines, their true legacy is human, a legacy of endurance, of calm under pressure, of brotherhood forged in darkness. They proved that courage isn't loud. It doesn't shout or boast. It breathes quietly in the dark, waiting, listening, doing its duty even when no one sees. The men of the silent service never sought recognition, but history owes them everything. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the war's great weapons, the carriers, the bombers, the atomic fire, took the headlines. But beneath the waves, the submariners knew the truth. The war had already been won, not in the skies, not on the beaches, but in the cold, dark silence of the sea. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the men of the silent service surfaced into a world that would never truly understand what they had endured. They had fought not for fame or glory, but because the job had to be done, and they did it with unmatched skill and quiet courage. Beneath the waves, in darkness and fear, they turned the tide of a global war. Their victories had no parades, no headlines, only the eternal gratitude of a world they helped to save. The ocean still keeps their secrets, but history remembers their silence as one of the loudest triumphs of World War II. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share it with your friends and family so more people can learn about the unseen heroes and forgotten moments of World War II. Every share keeps their memory alive. And if you want to keep discovering powerful stories of courage, innovation, and sacrifice beneath the waves and beyond, subscribe to WW2 Courage and join us in honoring the history that shaped our world.